Hello, and welcome to this episode of the K&Co Tech Podcast. I'm joined today by my friend and fellow analyst, Zeus Kerravala of ZK Research. Hey, Zeus, how are you?
Hey, Shelly, how you been?
You know, good, and it's great to see you. So we are going to dive into the topic of why devices still matter. And we're going to take a look at earlier this week, Mitel announced a somewhat significant strategic move, relocating their IP phone production to Germany with a partnership with Gigaset. And this is, we're talking about 1 million devices annually. This announcement comes at what I think is kind of a pivotal moment for Mitel. We've got the successful financial restructuring. We've got the appointment of a new CEO. We've got the revamped board of directors that happened in July, featuring industry veterans from Vonage and GTT Comms and HP Poly and other major comms companies. And while much of the industry narrative, and certainly the narrative that you and I are both immersed in, focuses on cloud first and SaaS-only strategies, Mitel's device production move signals what I think is kind of a contrarian move, but I think a strategically sound bet. Physical devices aren't going away, and they're evolving into critical components of a hybrid comms infrastructure. And this is something that a lot of enterprises really need. So that sort of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about here. Let's talk about the bigger picture here, Zeus. So, I said Mitel just moved the production of 1 million devices annually to Germany, and phones that many might consider legacy tech, right? But you and I both know that there's a much more interesting story here about what enterprises really need versus what vendors are pushing. And so set the stage for us a little bit, if you would. What do you see really happening in the UC market right now?
Yeah, well, phones are legacy tech for knowledge workers
They
like
are.
you and I. However, we only make up about 20% of the workforce. The other 80% are frontline workers, and most of them do use phones.
Sure.
And so I suppose there is a certain segment that would look at this and go, what do I care? But if you're a clinician, a campus worker, you work in a warehouse,
Right.
any one of a number of frontline workers, they still rely heavily on the phone.
Right.
And so I do think it's an important part of it, and often forgotten part of it, because most of the UC tools that we've seen developed have been targeted towards the knowledge worker. But
Right.
more and more, I am seeing the UC vendors now look at Frontline as an untapped opportunity. And this is where I think the ability, having your own phones does make a difference. In fact, nobody's got a broader set of phones than Mitel does, right? They've got a phone for almost everything, low-end feature phones, all the way up to these really advanced executive phones. And I think they've been one of the few vendors that have stuck in there with it, and I think they've had a lot of success with that. In fact, I think in their press release, they said that Frost and Sullivan has got the market at about $2 billion annually. So, that's a pretty healthy market for something that people say is legacy.
That's a pretty healthy market indeed. And, you have enterprises in regulated industries, healthcare, government, critical infrastructure, that aren't really interested in going full cloud. And then you've got growing concerns around data sovereignty and security and operational control. And the reality of it is, I think Mitel today serves a 75 plus million user base. I mean, that tells us that there is no shortage of people who are very interested in this legacy tech.
Yeah, I think we're a little skewed in North America because that's where the growth of the adoption in UCaaS has been. If you go, Mitel's big base obviously is in Europe, and their data sovereignty does reign supreme, especially since, over the last few years, where more and more European organizations have ensured, put in tougher and tougher data privacy laws, and that has caused companies to actually repatriate workloads back to on-prem, right? And I'm not saying it's only UC things. There's other markets that have done that, but I think in those cases, on-prem or private cloud-based UC actually is a preferred model. And I think as AI becomes a bigger part of this, we'll see more of that as companies look to have better control of their data to which they apply the AI models to.
Right. Well, and I think that, the desk phone that so many are eager to write off. I think of it in some ways when the conversation comes up about email being dead and nobody uses email anymore. Well, that's really not correct.
Yeah.
And I think that regardless of the other channels that we communicate in, and you and I communicate in all the channels, right? On social, via text message, email, everything else. But all of us get up every day and check our email. I mean, it is still an incredibly important channel, as are, I think, desk phones in many instances. And you mentioned it before, frontline workers and, retail, hospitality, manufacturing. Some of those people can't carry smartphones. You've got emergency response systems that demand physical endpoints. You've got, really sometimes it's the reliability of users who need consistent tools that aren't going to go down because there's a problem with a connection or something like that. So I think that there are some real use cases here, and speed, simplicity, and reliability are important in a lot of cases.
Yeah, no, I think in fact, if you go to a lot of those types of industries that you mentioned, right, you think of in a clinician station or in a retail environment, even a lot of small businesses, auto shops, things like that, they
Right,
do rely heavily on the phone because it's a better device for that type of environment. So
right.
their phones aren't going away anytime soon. Is there huge growth in it? No. But for the industries and the people that rely on them,
Yeah,
they're there. And I think the quality and reliability of those devices matters. And I think that's
yeah.
one of the reasons why Mitel moved to manufacturing.
It's funny, as a brief aside here, my husband and I were watching something the other night, and it was an older show, and there was someone with a wall phone in their kitchen that you and I'm sure, both grew up with, right? The wall phone with the cord that you stretched all the way through the house, trying to find some modicum of privacy. But my husband looked at that and he said, "Oh, I miss those phones." And when you think about it just a little bit from a personal standpoint, not at all from a business standpoint, but think about in some ways how much easier our lives were when we didn't have these handheld devices that are everywhere in our lives, that suck us in, even if we don't want them to. And as a result of these devices that are always on and always in our pockets or always in our hands, we never have the ability to disconnect. And I think there are people among us who maybe, put those phones away and don't touch them for 12 hours at a time. But there are other people who don't. And so I think that maybe was a little bit of what my husband was wistfully pining for, of those days when you could actually, sort of check out and just
Yeah,
use
but
that wall
we
phone.
all we did is we shifted the communications mode. So today,
Yeah.
if you take a flight and you don't have connectivity, you land, you got like 100 emails. It used to be you
Right.
took a flight, you landed, you had 25 voicemails, right?
Right.
So we've kind of moved the mode of which we try and communicate. I don't know, was it better? It was certainly different, but
Yeah.
um, phones, if, like I said, to a lot of industries, they're still using them that way, right? And
Yeah.
they play a very important role in making sure people can do their jobs.
Yeah. And you know what? Yes, there was some satisfaction. And I am not the person who does this a lot or did this a lot, but there is some satisfaction with having those desk phones to be able to just say, "Okay, and that's enough of this conversation," and hang up. I know you've probably never done that. You've never been irritated with anybody ever, right?
Nope.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the strategic play that the Made in Germany part of this conversation addresses. So, this isn't just about manufacturing phones, this is about supply chain resilience, geopolitical positioning, and a competitive differentiation. Mitel is partnering with Gigaset in Bokel, Germany, which brings TAA compliance, the manufacturing, the precision manufacturing that Germans are known for, shorten lead times for European customers who make up a big part of Mitel's customer base. And so let's unpack the strategic thinking here. What do you think makes this move particularly smart right now?
Yeah. Well, first, the Gigaset relationship actually inherited through the Unify acquisition, right? So
Yes.
formerly
Yes.
Siemens Enterprise. So Siemens phones were actually designed or manufactured by Gigaset. In fact, they were called Gigaset phones. Now, Mitel's manufacturing been done in China, and if you were just to ask any random Joe on the street, are Chinese anythings built better than German anythings, right? It's always going to be German, right?
Yes.
You think German cars versus Chinese cars, things like that,
Yes.
right? And so the quality of engineering and the excellence in which the Germans build things now Mitel can bring to its phone. I think, if you think about the supply chain, if there's one thing that the post-pandemic era taught us, is that the supply chain is pretty fragile,
Right.
right? And we can be subject to shipping issues and, supply shortages, things like that. And in fact, we had a huge shortages in products, and organizations have been working very hard to try and improve the resiliency of their supply chain. And for me, this does this for Mitel. Instead of having to ship parts all over
Yep.
the world,
Yep.
they can now control it all in Germany. Now, where the analogy of the cars falls down is German cars typically are a lot more expensive than Chinese cars.
Right.
But I think in this case, from my conversation with Mitel, the cost should be the same or even down a little bit, because their shipping costs will be so much lower.
Exactly.
Right. And so I think from this case, it's a win-win for the customer. They're not going to have to pay more, but they're going to get a better built device, of which Mitel has more control of it. And
Yeah.
if you think about the old Siemens phones, those were very well built devices. So you could throw those things around and they keep working. So,
Right.
and so the Germans know how to build things. I also think there's, in Europe, obviously, lowering your carbon footprint and sustainability efforts is a big deal.
Huge.
And
Yes.
you think of the Scope 2 impact for Mitel, which would then get passed along to be part of the Scope 2 and 3, effects for their enterprise customers, right? While not a big part of this, I think it is a notable part for their European customer base,
I agree.
for the overall carbon footprint. And so I think just when you look at the shift, it's not going to cost them more. It's going to bring a better built device with a lower carbon footprint. And I think the TAA compliance, that's actually going to matter to the US customer base.
Yes.
For governments, things like that, you still have to have that. So I think it's just, for Mitel, it was the right thing to do. They had the relationship with the facility anyways. So moving it over actually was, I don't think it was a heavy lift for them,
Yeah.
but it gives them better built devices at a lower cost and, that are more sustainable. So it's just like it's just a win all around.
Yeah. And I think one other point here, Zeus, is that it really reinforces the company's commitment to European markets. And I think that that's important. And that move goes a long way toward doing that.
Yeah. Well, given the investment in Unify
Right.
that they made, I think that they laid down the gauntlet on their European investment. And frankly, from just an overall market perspective, that's where they are seeing the most uptick. There's a lot of mid-sized businesses that still rely on on-prem,
Yeah.
UC there, where, again, here in North America, you see a lot of the cloud solutions, there for the foreseeable future. It'll be a lot of on-prem UC because of the things we already talked about in the areas of privacy, sustainability,
Right.
data, residency, things like that. So for them, it just makes so much sense for them to do this, right? And like I said, since they had the relationship with Gigaset through the Unify partnership, it was an easy move for them.
Right. Kind of a no-brainer, really. Well, a move like this doesn't happen in isolation. We know that, right? So let's connect the dots between this device strategy and Mitel's broader positioning in the UC landscape. They're not abandoning cloud. They're one of the few vendors offering true choice, on-prem, hybrid, private cloud, public cloud, hybrid. And in a market where almost everyone else has gone SaaS-only, what do you think this positioning means for Mitel's competitive edge?
Yeah, well, the phones aren't necessarily tied to on-prem, right?
Right?
You may need phones if you're using a cloud solution. I think their install base being so European based does allow them to sell these, the phones along with these UC deals. And so
Right.
typically when you upgrade your PBX or your IP PBX in this case, you often upgrade the phones with it. And so they've been one of the few manufacturers that have continued to drive more and more innovation into the devices. They have some of the cameras, they have some, with that are completely buttonless and things like that. They have a VPN phone, for remote workers, things like that. So
Right.
I think for them, and they do have cloud partnerships as well, and whether you want to buy a UCaaS solution or UC solution through them, you get the same phone and same phone experience.
Right. Well, and I think that really, with so many other vendors shifting to SaaS, 100% to SaaS, this leaves, a huge opportunity and leaves kind of the market wide open for Mitel.
Yeah, well, they were really last man standing there, right?
Right.
Avaya has really shifted to upmarket, and so Avaya had a big European base too, and so all of that's in play now. And you think of the other vendors, many of which Mitel bought, Toshiba, Panasonic, Intertel. There's a ton of phones
Right.
out there that are ripe for refresh, and I think giving them faster access to those phones allows them to flip their competitive base a little bit easier and a little bit faster.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a lot going on at Mitel over the course of the last, I don't know, 6 months or so. We've got, some huge corporate moves. In June of 2025, Mitel emerged from financial restructuring. I think a very savvy move that wiped out 1.15 billion in debt and really kind of set the stage for the path forward. In July, they announced a new board of directors with some heavy hitters across the industry, bringing a different depth of experience to the board. In September, Mike Robinson came in, a post-restructuring specialist as the CEO with telecom and infrastructure expertise. Let's connect those dots, if you would, for me, Zeus. How do you see this production move fitting into Mitel's post-restructuring strategy, and what do you think it signals about where they're headed?
Well, when they restructured, one of the things I put in my note is that they've been working towards this, for a
Yeah.
long time. And it's interesting if you look at the reasons why, say, the Jim Chirico and Alan Masaryk restructurings didn't work at Avaya,
Yeah.
was they restructured and then they redid the strategy, right? Which was backwards. I think what Mitel did was they spent a lot of time under Tarun Lumba redoing the strategy. Then they went through the financial restructuring, and now they're at a point where they've shed the debt. They've got the product roadmap in place.
Yeah.
Right? And now it's time to execute. Right. And so I think from an execution perspective, everything's in place for them to go capitalize the market. In fact, lots of things fell into place. Right. So they got the restructuring done. The competitive landscape is lightened up with Avaya shifting its focus up market. Right. We've had a lot of geopolitical issues that have caused European companies to rethink their data residency, which favors on-prem.
Absolutely.
Right. And so all arrows point to them. They should have some success as they execute their go forward plan. I think what the phone piece of this does is it lets them flip the competitive install base and even their own older install base and be able to refresh the devices along with it, right? And understand these devices are a lot smarter today, right? They've got more sensors in them. They got better displays on them, things like that. And so you could actually think of the phone as part of critical infrastructure in a branch as you would Wi-Fi and networking and things like that. And so I think this was it's just a continuation of that execution strategy of being able to get more solutions to customers faster, right? Versus having to wait on things to be delivered from China and shipped across the globe and things like that, which just creates delays and a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, I agree. And I just see this as this device production move is really kind of tangible evidence of the company's long-term commitment and the strategic clarity that we're starting to see come out of, the last few months of work.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, I think once Tarun stepped down, he put an execution person in place, which is Mike. So you could argue that this was one of the final pieces of the puzzle, right? You can ship the systems, but you got to be able to ship the phones along with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Let's talk a little bit. So we both have been following Mitel for many years now, and of course, especially through the restructuring and the strategic evolution of the company. Let's talk a little bit about what's your sense of what the industry community, the analyst community, the industry as a whole is saying and thinking about Mitel's position in the UC landscape. Do you think Mitel is getting the recognition it deserves, or is there a perception gap between what the company's actually delivering and what the market thinks they're doing and or capable of?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty big perception gap. I think part of that is just, again, with most of the analyst industry being in the US,
Yeah,
we see a lot of momentum, for the UCAS vendors. And so I think, Mitel strategy gets lost a little bit and flies a little bit under the radar.
right.
But one of the things I can tell you is since the AI wave has taken hold, right, companies like NVIDIA have made, on-prem cool again. And typically, the communications industry lags behind other industries by a couple of years.
Yeah,
And I think this is another case where this industry, is Mitel is flying under the radar, and I think just with good execution. And part of that, look, when you go through a financial restructuring and the CEO change and all the issues Mitel's had over the years, it
right.
does raise questions about your viability. And so, we've laid it out that it's time for them to execute. And if they put up numbers and they show some growth, then I think they will get the industry recognition.
Yeah.
They just haven't done that to date. And so now I think it's time for them to execute, put up the results, and that'll get them the recognition that I think they're not really getting today.
I think it's execution and maybe doing a better job of telling their story. And that's not something, by the way, that's exclusive to Mitel. I think that a lot of tech vendors kind of need to do a better job on that front. But what we've seen from Mitel is that they can deliver reliable voice, communications, collaboration, contact center platforms in really high consequence industries. So, it's not that they have shown their capability and their chops. I think what they really need now is to continue to make things happen and to really do a better job of embracing being more vocal and telling their story across the board and across both the United States and Europe.
Yeah, and a lot of their install base was smaller businesses historically, and so
Yeah,
those don't have the same kind of logo power that the Fortune 500 would.
yeah,
I think what Unify brought them was a lot of large logos, though, and so
yeah,
as they convert that base to Mitel, I think that does give them some stories to tell with some logos that are you
yeah.
know a lot more recognizable globally than
I
your
agree.
small 20-person law firm
Yeah.
in Germany or something like that, right?
Well, and I think what people may lose sight of is that this is a 50-plus-year-old company with 75 plus million users and 100 plus countries that they're operating in. They've got a partner ecosystem of more than 6,000 partners. So, this is no small company and no small ecosystem that they've created.
No, they've rolled up a lot. They rolled up almost the entire legacy base, and so
Yeah.
all those companies put together have made a much bigger company than I think people give
Yeah.
realization to. And like I said, I think with Avaya's move up market, it opens up that entire IP office space
Yeah.
to them right now. So
Lots of opportunity.
yeah.
So we can't have a conversation today ever without talking about AI. So let's talk about AI devices and the edge and where all this goes next. So as we know, right, and as we live all day, every day, AI is reshaping everything in communications and everything else. But AI doesn't have to mean cloud only. And with Mitel designing the hardware and owning the software, I think there's an opportunity here for AI-driven embedded capabilities at the edge. What do you see on that front? And what do you think the vision here is for intelligent devices that might do more than just make calls?
Yeah, they haven't really talked about that, and I'd encourage them to.
Yeah,
I do think, as I said before, I think the device or endpoint or whatever you want to call it can be considered part of critical infrastructure of a branch.
right.
It collects a lot of data. It generates a lot of data, like telemetry information on uh, who people are calling, when the devices are in use, and you can actually use that data as part of your overall understanding of worker behavior, which can then be used as part of your overall AI strategy. So I think you can
Right.
think of that phone, if you want to call it that, as really an edge computing device that you can do a
Yeah.
lot more with, right?
Right.
And so I'd be curious to hear from Mitel as to what they're thinking about there, but they got to be thinking about that. That there's no reason why that phone can't be more than a phone and have a lot of the data pulled off. It can be used as part of an organization's AI
Yeah.
strategy.
Well, and I think, there are some practical AI applications, right? Noise cancellation, smart routing, predictive analytics, and I think there's a lot to be said for device level intelligence that doesn't require constant cloud connectivity. And when you've got AI at the edge versus cloud dependency, again, I think there are some benefits there. So it'll be interesting to maybe dive a little bit deeper with Mitel on this and see what their thinking is in terms of the future ahead.
Yeah, especially once you get into conference rooms,
Right.
right? There's a lot of stuff you can use AI to make sure everyone in the meeting can hear the call properly, from a camera perspective, things like that. So there's a bigger story to be told here that Mitel has yet to tell.
Yeah.
And, I guess I'm looking forward to seeing what that is. But,
Yeah.
to your question, I think the phone does become an edge computing device down the road.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, here's what strikes me, and we've talked about this throughout this conversation. While the industry narrative is all cloud all the time, Mitel is making a contrarian bet on hybrid, on devices, on choice, and on flexibility. And that's not really contrarian if that's what organizations really need, right? So let's talk about, I think that we both agree here that Mitel's strategy, exemplified by this production move and other things that the company has done, is actually it's pragmatic, it's customer focused, and I think that it'll win in the long run. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting to use the word contrarian. I think it's just practical,
Yeah.
more than contrarian. I think they as a company, they had a decision to make, right? And when Tarun Lumba took over as CEO, he had to decide whether he was going to chase cloud down or or maybe focus a little bit more on. So what the company chose to
Right.
do was focus on what it did well, which was build on-prem systems. And so
And
I've used the
what they knew their customers wanted.
yeah, I use the analogy. It's a little bit like, Dell 20 years ago, right? So they were trying to do cloud, but they very quickly realized that market was moving to other vendors, and so they
Right.
retrenched and they became, a really good server vendor. And I think the one thing that Dell has shown over the years is even though something's perceived as legacy, you can make a lot of money off it if you execute that well, right? And so there, like I said, in the on-prem, private cloud UC space, it's not growing at the same rate as UCaaS, but it's a big market for which there's only really one vendor for today,
Right.
and that's Mitel. And so, I think the bet that they made has paid off for them because they are the last man standing, and
Yeah.
just like Dell had done in the server world, they can do this in the UC world. And
Yeah.
there's as people ask me all the time, like, do I think there'll be a day when all UC is in the cloud? And my response is maybe, but I'll be 50 years retired by the time that happens. So
It's
for
kind of
all
like
intents,
about the same time email is going to go away.
yeah. So for all intents and purposes,
Yeah.
the market is here and here to stay for the foreseeable future. And
Yeah.
like I said, they're really the only game in town.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the reason I use the word contrarian is because, there's such a mindset that cloud is the only way to go. And, we have so many vendor driven narratives sort of pushing that. But the customer reality is that this one size fits all mindset doesn't work. It doesn't work, in all enterprise comms. And so, I think companies that solve real problems for customers are important, and that's what Mitel is doing for a significant customer base.
Yeah, well, like I said, people think that, but then once you get into the AI space, NVIDIA has made the whole concept of on-prem, cool again, right? And because most of their stuff is deployed in private data centers to do a lot of very advanced stuff, and nobody thinks about shifting that stuff to the cloud, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, to wrap up, this move to made in Germany production represents a lot more than just a manufacturing decision. I think it's a statement about Mitel's strategic clarity coming out of the restructuring that the company has been doing. We got new leadership, a strengthened board, eliminated debt, some, funding to spur some innovation that they want to embark upon, and really a clear focus on hybrid communications. And I think as a result, Mitel is positioned to capture enterprise customers who need more than cloud-only solutions can provide. And I think that we have shown in this conversation, Zeus, that devices aren't dying, they're evolving. And companies like Mitel that embrace it, recognize this reality, and invest in things like supply chain resilience and giving customers choices that are, that speak to their needs and desires. I think that Mitel is investing in what customers need, 1 million devices at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a big market. So
it's a big market. Absolutely. Well, Zeus Kerravala, ZK Research, thanks so much for joining me today. I always enjoy our conversations, and we'll see you again very soon, I'm sure.